The victim's back, stretched taut as a drum, cold steel slicing the skin along the spine. The crack of ribs broken one by one and bent outward, creating a bloody semblance of wings. And the finale. The lungs, pulled from the still living body, fluttering on the back like the wings of a dying eagle. This image became the hallmark of Viking cruelty. But what if none of it ever happened? What if the most famous and terrifying execution in history is a fake, more than 1,000 years old? We are launching a forensic investigation into the past to separate fact from fiction. And here is our first piece of evidence. This entire grandiose legend, which has defined the reputation of a whole people, rests on just 9 medieval texts. That's fewer than the number of chapters in an average book. Our investigation will show that the truth about the blood eagle is even stranger and more surprising than the myth itself. There are 2 fundamental paradoxes in this case. The first, how did the blood eagle become a world-renowned symbol of the era if the entire legend is built on a few lines in late sagas, which modern science considers the result of a simple translation error? The second paradox is anatomical. How could the Vikings perform an execution where the key element was fluttering wings, when any modern surgeon can confirm that the victim would have died of suffocation in the first few seconds? The physiology of this process is like a blacksmith's bellows with a huge hole in it. No matter how much you pull the handles, they can no longer draw in air because the seal is broken. These are not rhetorical questions. We will find the answer to the myth's popularity by examining the evidence of propaganda in the 5th section, and a surgeon's verdict in the 7th will explain the anatomical paradox. By the end of this investigation, you will have 7 key pieces of evidence from a historical detective's arsenal. You won't just learn the truth about the blood eagle. You will understand the precise mechanism by which the most persistent historical myths are born, live, and die. This skill, separating facts from propaganda, primary sources from later interpretations, will forever change how you see not only the Vikings, but how history itself is written. Right now, we will dissect the primary source of the myth, the ancient sagas. In 5 minutes, we will reveal the translation error that started it all. And in 10 minutes, we will see how the Vikings' enemies exploited it. In just 5 minutes, you will learn how a single mistranslated word gave birth to a 1,000-year-old nightmare. Let's start with the foundation. The 1,000-year-old nightmare stands on a base of 9 texts. At first glance, this is heroic, epic poetry. The sagas tell of the revenge of Ragnar Lodbrok's sons on King Ella, or the execution of Halfdan the Black. But here's a detail that is often overlooked. These sagas were written down 200, or even 300, years after the supposed events. It's as if someone today were writing an eyewitness memoir of the Napoleonic Wars, based on family stories. And here's the evidence that reveals the authors as dramatists, not chroniclers. In some versions, salt is poured into the victim's wounds. Physiologically, this is pointless, but as a symbol of eternal torment, it is incredibly effective. This proves that we must analyze the sagas as literature, not as a protocol. And the main key to the puzzle is hidden not in what they describe, but in how they describe it. If you examine these 9 texts under a microscope, another contradiction emerges. In some sagas, the blood eagle is an act of brutal revenge. In others, it's a complex ritual sacrifice to the god Odin. The general details are there. The back, the ribs bent outward, the lungs. But when linguists dated the texts, they discovered a pattern. The mention of Odin only appears in the latest versions of the sagas. Adding a religious meaning made the story more epic for listeners living centuries later. The myth grew like a tree. The original trunk of revenge was gradually covered with the new branches of ritual, making the canopy denser and more complex. This proves that if the authors invented the motive, they may have also misunderstood the act itself. What if we've been reading a poetic riddle all this time, not a chronicle? How did stories even survive for 300 years in a society where most people could neither read nor write? The answer: skalds, poet historians, the living libraries of their time. The sagas we read today are just a late recording of their oral performances. But an oral tradition is not a photocopier. Its goal is not documentary accuracy, but impact. Every talented skald considered it his duty not just to repeat a story, but to improve it, adding more blood and drama. It was a 3-century-long game of telephone. Imagine a Viking longhouse, the crackle of a fire in the hearth. The skald's job is to make the warriors' hearts beat faster, not to read a dry report. We were looking for clues in the plot, but they were hidden in the words themselves all along. So let's summarize. Our key witness, the sagas, has turned out to be completely unreliable. We have established 3 facts. The source of the myth is minuscule. It was written centuries after the events, and it is full of internal contradictions and literary embellishments. Trusting a detailed description of an execution from such a source is like reconstructing the history of the Trojan War based solely on Homer's epic. It's an epic, not a chronicle. Therefore, we must shift the focus of our investigation. The biggest clue is hidden not in what the sagas describe, but in how they do it. Not in the plot, but in the language. What if we have been reading a poetic metaphor all this time, but perceiving it as instructions for torture? Now we will dissect the language itself, and what we find there will destroy the myth to its foundations. What if the phrase, to carve an eagle on the back, actually meant to leave the body for real eagles to tear apart? This sounds absurd, but only if you don't know about the Vikings' secret poetic language. The key to the puzzle is the kenning. This is a poetic riddle, a replacement of a simple word with a complex metaphor. For a skald, the sea is the whale's road. A battle is the thunder of swords. A warrior is a tree of shields. But these are not just beautiful images. They are a cultural code, understood only by insiders. And in 1984, linguist Roberta Frank proposed a hypothesis that became a death sentence for the myth. She suggested that to carve an eagle was a kenning describing a quick death from a sword blow to the back. Afterward, the fallen enemy's body was left as a feast for real eagles. It sounds like a nice theory, but is there any real linguistic evidence for it? Yes, there is. And it's hidden in other skaldic verses. If eagle is a metaphor, why is it so cruel and specific? Because the eagle, along with the raven, was a standard poetic image. They are the beasts of battle, the eternal companions of the god Odin, who feast on the bodies of the fallen. This image migrated from one saga to another. In poetry unrelated to the execution, we find lines where the eagle drew with its claws on the backs of enemies. This proves that the image of an eagle on the back already existed as a metaphor and was not a unique description of a torture method. But here is the decisive clue. In the earliest text, the verb used alongside the word eagle more likely means to mark or to scratch, not to carve. This is an erosion of meaning. The original word, over time and under the pressure of new cultural layers, was worn down, transforming into the more terrifying to carve. The translation error is obvious, but was it accidental? To understand this, we need to look at who wrote down the sagas. They were Christian scholars of the 13th century, like Snorri Sturluson. They lived 300 years after the Viking Age and were trying to save its fading pagan heritage. A noble mission. But there's a catch. These men were products of their Christian era. To them, the pagan Vikings were cruel savages and enemies of the faith. Therefore, a bloody and literal interpretation of the poetry fit perfectly into their worldview. Here's the mechanism of the myth's birth. One influential author misunderstood a complex kenning and wrote down its literal meaning. And since less than 1% of Scandinavia's population could read in the 13th century, his text became the absolute authority. Subsequent authors simply copied the mistake, adding ever more details. Thus, a single misunderstood word grew into a snowballing myth. This mistake was not accidental. It was advantageous. So the linguistic evidence is irrefutable. The bloody ritual turned out to be a complex poetic image. We've established that the image of the eagle was standard in Viking poetry, and that the key verb originally had a different meaning. The legend was born not on the battlefield, but at the desk of a scribe who didn't understand what he was reading. Two factors: a translation error and a cultural gap. But this error fell on fertile ground. It was advantageous to the Vikings' main enemies. From a simple literary mishap, it turned into a weapon in a great information war. We thought this was a story about cruelty, but it turned out to be a story about propaganda. And now we will see how it worked. Why did the Vikings, specifically, become the epitome of evil in an age when cruelty was the norm? The answer is simple. History was written by their victims. Imagine the world through the eyes of a 9th century Christian monk. A Viking raid is not just a robbery. It is an invasion of pagans into the holiest of holies, monasteries where knowledge and relics are kept. For the chronicler, it was a literal invasion of the forces of hell. And here's the twist that changes everything. These very monks had a monopoly on creating written sources. They controlled the information. In this case, history was written not by the victors, but by the victims. And they had every motive to paint a darker picture. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 is described not as a military operation, but as the end of the world, with fiery dragons in the sky and famine. This is not a report. It is propaganda, and it had a cold, pragmatic goal. To make people fight and pay taxes for war, you need to present the enemy not as a human, but as a monster. The blood eagle is the perfect image for this purpose. It is irrational, ritualistic, and utterly inhuman. But this propaganda also had a second, internal objective. Europe at that time was a patchwork quilt of warring Christian kingdoms. The image of an absolute pagan evil was necessary for kings to stop their internal feuds and unite against a common enemy. The propaganda worked like adrenaline for a sick body. The external threat made the disparate organs forget their internal ailments. And here's the evidence that proves this bias. Arab merchants like Ibn Fadlan described the Vikings as strong traders and warriors, but not as ritualistic maniacs. This contrast proves that we are dealing with a deliberate demonization. But propaganda doesn't work in a vacuum. The Vikings were indeed cruel. They raided, killed, and traded slaves. We are not trying to whitewash them. But now let's put their cruelty into context. Their contemporary, the Christian Emperor Charlemagne, once ordered the execution of 400-500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. The scale of this massacre surpasses anything attributed to the Vikings in the chronicles over decades. And here is a fact that shatters the myth completely. Many sophisticated executions, like breaking on the wheel or quartering, which are so similar to the blood eagle, were actively practiced in civilized Christian Europe in later eras. The dichotomy of savage pagan versus civilized Christian is a fiction. So the motive is established. The myth of the blood eagle, born from a translation error, was too good to be untrue for the Vikings' enemies. It became the perfect weapon in an information war, serving specific goals, demonizing the enemy and consolidating their own forces. But text can lie. Propaganda can distort reality. Is there a way to verify all this objectively? Yes. We must stop reading and start digging. The evidence must be sought not in ink on parchment, but in the earth. It's time to question the most impartial science, archaeology. We have studied the words and motives, but what do the bones say?
How can a forensic expert prove or disprove a method of murder committed 1,000 years ago? At first glance, the task seems impossible. But for a forensic archaeologist, bones are an interrogation record. From the marks on vertebrae, they can distinguish beheading by a sword from execution by an axe. From cracks in the ribs, they can see a spear wound. This is routine. But the blood eagle would have left not routine traces, but a unique signature. Symmetrical damage to the ribs near the spine. Characteristic chips on the shoulder blades. It would be a killer's autograph, impossible to forge. And here's the fact. In over 150 years of systematic excavations of thousands of Viking Age burials, not a single skeleton with this set of injuries has been found. Perhaps the victims' bodies were simply not buried, burned, sunk in bogs, or left for predators. This is a logical objection, but it is shattered by other findings. Archaeologists regularly find mass graves of the Vikings' enemies. For example, in Dorset, England, a burial of 54 Vikings executed by locals was discovered. The marks of a brutal death are perfectly preserved on their bones. Dozens of beheaded bodies with traces of numerous blows. This proves that traces of violence are well preserved, and we do find them. And here's the paradox. We find hundreds of skeletons that were hacked or beheaded, but not a single one with signs of the ritual eagle. If the execution was symbolic and important, its traces should be found. Their complete absence is a glaring anomaly. Let's pause for a moment. Right now, you are the detective leading this case. You have all the evidence on your desk. Unreliable testimony from the sagas, a proven motive for propaganda, and a complete lack of physical evidence. What would your verdict be at this stage of the investigation? Write just one word in the comments right now. Fiction, if you believe the execution never happened, or reality, if you still believe it did. And while you deliver your verdict, we will examine the last, most controversial piece of evidence. The only image that, according to the myth's proponents, proves everything. So the complete silence of the bones is perhaps the loudest and most objective argument in our case. The earth, unlike text, does not lie, and it remains stubbornly silent. Archaeology, the most impartial of sciences, gives us not a single lead in favor of the blood eagle's reality. The absence of evidence, in this case, is itself powerful evidence of absence. It would seem the case could be closed. But the myth's proponents have one last ace up their sleeve. A single piece of evidence they cling to. It is not a text and not bones. It is an image carved in stone. The only picture capable of turning this entire investigation on its head. This stone is on the Swedish island of Gotland. Its name, Stora Hammers. If you look at one of its fragments, there is no doubt. Here's a man lying on an altar. Here's an executioner doing something to his back. And above them hovers a figure resembling a huge eagle. It looks like direct, irrefutable proof. A perfect match with the saga texts. But this clarity is an optical illusion.
It exists only as long as we are looking through a keyhole. Once you open the door, the picture changes. This stone is nearly 10 feet tall, and the scene with the altar is just one of dozens of stories carved on it. Warriors, ships, horsemen. This is not a photograph of torture. It is an ancient comic strip, a complex mythological narrative. And in the context of the whole story, the supposed eagle is most likely the god Odin himself in the form of a bird, or the soul of a warrior ascending to Valhalla. We are seeing a scene of sacrifice, not ritual execution. Viking art is not photography. It is a symbolic construction set. The artist took standard images, a ship, a serpent, a horseman, and assembled different stories from them. But here's the problem that makes a definitive interpretation impossible. These symbols had no single dictionary. A rider on an 8-legged horse could be the god Odin, or a simple warrior riding to the afterlife. Its meaning was determined only by the context. Viking art works not like a dictionary, but like a kitchen knife. In one scene, it cuts bread. In another, it defends a home. Only the surrounding objects tell us its role. Therefore, for the scene on the store of hammer stone, there are at least 3 equally plausible explanations. The myth of the theft of the meat of poetry, a shamanic ritual, or a sacrifice to Odin. Evidence with so many interpretations is not evidence in the court of history. So why, of all the versions, did the most brutal one become the most popular? The answer lies not in archaeology, but in 19th century culture. During the era of national romanticism, Scandinavian countries began to construct the image of the Viking as a national hero. And in this new ideology, his cruelty was not a vice, but a virtue, a sign of manliness and harsh justice. Scholars and writers of that time, like the Swede Erik Geiger, literally hunted for proof of this brutality, and the ambiguous scene on the store of hammer stone was a perfect fit for the role of physical evidence for a pre-existing theory. This stone is a historical Rorschach test. And 19th century culture saw in it what it desperately wanted to see: confirmation of its myth of the cruel but noble ancestor. So the only visual evidence has crumbled. It is too ambiguous and is more a reflection of our own expectations than the reality of the Viking Age. It seems the investigation can be concluded. The sagas are unreliable, archaeology is silent, and the image turned out to be a cultural projection. The myth is debunked. But in 2021, a group of scientists launched a surprising counterattack. They decided to test the legend from a completely different angle, asking the question, leaving history aside, was it even physically possible? We are moving from the world of ancient symbols to the world of modern science, from vague interpretations to the precision of a surgical scalpel, and the surgeon's verdict will prove to be the most paradoxical in this case. In 2021, a group of scientists conducted a decisive experiment. Using modern anatomical modeling, they tested whether the procedure could even be performed with Viking Age weapons, and the initial conclusion was sensational. Yes, it is technically possible. The ribs can be separated from the spine without damaging key arteries. For a moment, it seemed that science had sided with the sagas. But the modeling showed not only what could be done, but how long one could live afterward. And that answer destroyed the myth. According to the anatomist's conclusion, the victim would have died within seconds from shock, massive blood loss, and, most importantly, the immediate collapse of the lungs. Science delivered a paradoxical verdict. The procedure itself is technically feasible, but the ritual described in the sagas is not. Because its key element, a living and suffering victim, would be gone in the first 20 seconds. The most famous detail of the legend, the fluttering lungs placed on the shoulders like wings, turned out to be the main proof of its fictitiousness. As soon as the thoracic cavity is breached, the lungs instantly collapse under atmospheric pressure. It's like a vacuum-sealed bag of coffee. As long as it's intact, everything holds its shape. But one puncture, and the contents shrink. Lungs cannot flutter or breathe outside the body. They become 2 useless, deflated sacs. An executioner attempting to perform the ritual would not get dramatic wings, but a rapidly dying person with 2 pieces of dead tissue on their back. This anatomical illiteracy proves that the author was describing a poetic image, not a real procedure. So why did the saga authors, who lived in a world where violence was the norm, invent such unrealistic details? This is not a mistake born of ignorance. It is a deliberate artistic choice. Their task was not to create a medical report, but to forge a powerful and terrifying image. We readily forgive Hollywood action movies for having infinite ammo and unrealistic physics because we want spectacle, not a documentary. The saga authors were the directors of their time, and The Blood Eagle was their horror blockbuster. It is precisely this impossible detail, the living wings, that is the brand, the author's signature that screams, "This is fiction. This is art, not an eyewitness testimony." So the verdict of science is final. Yes, a body could be mutilated in a similar way. But no, it would not have looked like it does in the legend. The cruelest and most memorable part of the myth, its drama, is physiologically impossible. This is the final nail in the coffin. Where before we had an absence of evidence, now we have evidence of absence. All the threads of the investigation are in our hands. From the analysis of ancient poetry to the data from computer modeling. It is time to bring them all together and deliver the final verdict in the case of the Blood Eagle. So how did this historical monster arise from nothing? The answer is a simple recipe. Step 1. Take a complex poetic metaphor, a kenning, understood only by insiders. Step 2. Wait 300 years until its original meaning is completely forgotten. Step 3. Give this text to a person from a hostile culture who is already convinced of your savagery. Step 4. Allow them to interpret the metaphor literally, as it perfectly fits their propaganda goals.
Step 5. Add the 19th century cultural demand for brutal ancestors. Step 6. Popularize it through mass culture. The Blood Eagle is ready. It is not an execution. It is a literary virus that has mutated for 1,000 years, perfectly adapting to the fears of each new era. But which of all our arguments is irrefutable? The decisive argument in this case is not a single piece of evidence, but a perfect storm of them all. The saga texts are literature, written centuries later. The image on the stone is a multi-layered mythological story. Every piece of evidence in favor of the myth crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. But the evidence against it works like mountain streams. Individually, each can be stepped over. But when they merge into a single torrent, they demolish any dam of doubt. The complete silence of archaeology is confirmed by the linguistic hypothesis of a metaphor. This hypothesis, in turn, is perfectly explained by the propagandistic context. And the anatomical impossibility of the ritual itself provides the final word. Verdict. The Blood Eagle is not a historical fact. It is a literary artifact, born from a triple distortion: poetic, translational, and propagandistic. Case closed. But why is it so hard for us to let go of this myth? Because the myth of the Blood Eagle is simple. It divides the world into black and white, into heroes and monsters. The truth is always more complex. It requires intellectual effort. By rejecting this myth, we lose a vivid image from TV shows, but we gain something immeasurably greater. We begin to see the Vikings not as cartoonish maniacs, but as complex people who created one of the most sophisticated poetic traditions in history. And here's the main takeaway. The story of how a translation error and propaganda created a historical monster is a far more thrilling and relevant story than the legend of the torture itself. It teaches us how the mechanism of fake news, a mechanism that is already 1,000 years old, works. This is precisely what historian Roberta Frank proved back in 1984. But if the eagle never existed, does that mean the Vikings were good? The verdict has been rendered. The blood eagle has been found to be a literary fiction based on the totality of the evidence. But what does this change in our view of the Vikings? Absolutely nothing. Debunking one myth does not make them any less cruel. They still raided, killed, and traded slaves. This verdict does not absolve them. It cleanses history of fiction so that we can begin a new, more honest conversation. How should we now understand Viking cruelty? How can we separate fact from fiction and other stories about their era? The answers to these questions are in the final part of our investigation. Our investigation has shown how the humanities can work like forensic science. We have seen that an ancient text is not a window into the past, but a crime scene that must be studied with extreme caution. The Skald's word turned out to be a poetic riddle, not a protocol. The weapon of propaganda revealed the motive for distorting facts. The main lesson from this block of evidence is this. You must always ask 4 questions. Who wrote it? When? For whom?
And for what purpose? Reading an ancient text is like listening to a stranger's story. You instinctively pay attention not only to what they say, but to their tone, to what they omit, and to who benefits from their story. This method allows us to hear the true voice of the past, not its distorted echo. But texts are only half the story. Modern technology has given us even more powerful tools for interrogating the past. The second set of clues came from the world of natural sciences. They allowed us to test ancient myths for their durability. The silence of the bones became the loudest argument. In 150 years of excavating thousands of Viking-age burials, not a single skeleton has been found with traces even remotely resembling the blood eagle. This is a deafening silence. The absence of evidence became evidence of absence. And the surgeon's verdict, based on computer modeling, finished off the myth for good, proving its physiological impossibility. The lesson here is simple. Texts give us a hypothesis, and archaeology and anatomy test it. This system of cross-checking is the most powerful lie detector we have. And in the case of the blood eagle, it showed that the myth does not stand up to criticism on any level. We have learned to separate fact from fiction. But what should we do now with this truth about Viking cruelty? If the eagle never existed, does that mean the Vikings were less cruel? The answer is direct and honest. No. Rejecting one myth does not erase historical facts. They still raided monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793, where monks were killed or taken into slavery. They still waged ruthless wars and built a large part of their economy on the slave trade. Their world was harsh and cruel by our standards, and that is an undeniable fact. The difference lies elsewhere. We are replacing a cartoonish, cinematic cruelty with a real, historical one. This allows us to see the Vikings not as one-dimensional villains from comic books, but as complex people of their time, capable of both incredible cruelty and the creation of great art. What is more important for understanding the past? One vivid but false myth, or many complex but true facts? This investigation brings us to a final question. We have journeyed from a shocking legend to its complete debunking, using the entire arsenal of the historical detective. But what is actually more dangerous for our understanding of the past? On one hand, there is real documented cruelty that is often difficult to process. On the other hand, there is a vivid, captivating but completely fabricated myth that shapes the image of an entire era. Which of these does more harm to our consciousness? Write just one word in the comments. Write reality, if you believe it's more dangerous to ignore real cruelty. Or write myth if you think the greater threat comes from beautiful and infectious fictions that substitute for history. Reality or myth? Let's decide this together.